In the dark, crushing depths of the North Sea, a diver's worst nightmare becomes a heart-stopping, desperate fight for survival. What will be written in the fate of the diver? Let's dive in to uncover this true story. The film begins with Chris, who meets his fiancée Morgan in a container before leaving for duty as a diver. His job involves fitting pipelines 1,000 feet underwater, a tough task. Afterwards, Chris heads to Clipper Key, where he meets Duncan after encountering some staff along the way. As they move forward, we see a setup of heavy machinery in this ship. Then we're introduced to a group of people, including Chris, who are all gathered for a 28-day diving mission. Craig arrives and explains the pipeline fitting task to everyone, dividing them into 3 teams, A, B, and C. Team A consists of Duncan, Chris, and Dave, who must work together. After Craig leaves, Chris tries to strike up a conversation with Dave, revealing that Dave is a serious and focused individual who avoids unnecessary gossip. Chris then leaves, and Duncan praises Chris to Dave, mentioning their previous work together. Afterwards, all teams head to their respective chambers. We see Duncan, Chris, and Dave together, where Chris places a photo of Morgan beside his bed. Dave questions Chris about it, advising him to focus on work. Duncan reassures Chris that Dave's nature is just like that. Once all teams are settled, Craig informs them that the doors will now be closed. Each team reports their positions, and we see the doors to the 3 chambers close. Craig monitors the teams via CCTV and communicates with them through a microphone. The ship is then taken out to sea, and we see the team members' daily routine, including exercise, relaxation, and meals. During a meal, Duncan reveals that this is his last ride, as he's completed 20 years of service. His teammates show concern upon hearing this. We see Chris stays updated on his fiancée's routine throughout the day. Later, we see the ship facing a severe storm at sea, and the divers must work in these treacherous conditions. In the control room, the team discusses the storm in the North Sea and decides that the team must dive near the manifold. Craig wakes up Team A, including Chris, in the middle of the night, instructing them to leave their chamber and head to the bell. Team A prepares, gathering essential items like knives and compasses, and heads to the bell. Dave tells Chris to follow his lead, and it's clear that Dave doesn't think much of Chris. Team A is now in the bell, the door is closed, and they're lifting off from the saturation chamber. The bell jerks as it's lifted into the stormy sea, marking the beginning of their mission. What will happen in this sea storm? How will they complete their mission? Let's continue to uncover more. In the stormy sea, the bell stops at a depth of 300 feet. Duncan opens the door and maintains the water temperature, preparing the divers. Dave is the first to exit the bell, ready with his oxygen cylinders and safety helmet. He jumps into the sea and notifies the head office, followed by Chris. Both divers descend to the sea floor, carrying a connector to attach to the manifold. They successfully connect the connector, powering up the manifold and illuminating it. As Dave and Chris enter the manifold, the control room's screens begin troubleshooting and warning alarms sound. Dave and Chris are engrossed in their work, unaware of the chaos outside. In the head office, warnings flash as the thrusters go offline, and the room erupts into urgency. Dave notices the ship moving out of position and instructs Chris to exit the manifold. They rapidly climb upward, reaching the top of the manifold, where they update the head office. However, as Chris ascends, his umbilical cord gets snagged. The ship is violently jerking in the stormy sea, and Chris's rope is stuck in the manifold's connector. Chris tries to pull his rope, but it causes the connector to disconnect from the manifold, shutting off the power and plunging everything into darkness. Duncan provides the divers with umbilical cords, but they're running out in the bell. Chris is stuck, unable to move up or down. He's trapped in the chaos. Everyone in the head office and the divers are worried. What will happen next? Will Chris escape this chaos, or will he remain stuck in the stormy sea attached to the manifold? Chris's umbilical cord tightens, making it difficult for him to breathe. Dave instructs Chris to switch to his bailout system. Chris now has only 10 minutes of oxygen left in his cylinders. The control room has also noticed this development. Dave reassures Chris that he'll return to rescue him, but until then, Chris must stay at the top of the manifold. If Chris moves, Dave might not be able to find him in the massive stormy sea. Dave continues to instruct Chris, but a strong gust of wind causes the ship to jerk violently, tightening Chris's umbilical cord until it snaps, and he falls away from the manifold. Dave is pulled upward, and Chris loses his connection to the bell. Dave climbs back to the bell, and Duncan tries to pull Chris's umbilical cord up, but it's broken. Duncan becomes worried, and Dave returns to the bell, informing Duncan about Chris's situation. In the control room, Craig is extremely concerned about his divers and discusses their situation with the captain, trying to find a way to rescue them. Chris now has less than 8 minutes of oxygen left. We see Chris lighting a flare in the dark sea and calling out for Duncan and Dave, disoriented and unsure of his location. His compass has stopped working, and he uses the light to search for the manifold, trying to find his way back to the top as Dave instructed. In the control room, the captain asks Officer Hannah for help in controlling the ship's movements to rescue Chris. Hannah is hesitant, not wanting to risk the ship in the natural disaster. However, the captain and Hannah eventually work together to control the ship. With less than 4 minutes of oxygen left, Chris finally reaches the manifold. The question now is whether the officers can rescue Chris in time. Will Chris escape alive from the stormy sea within these 4 minutes? We wait to see what fate has in store for Chris. In the stormy sea, Chris, breathing heavily, begins to climb the manifold. Overwhelmed by the water pressure and fear of death, Chris struggles to climb but refuses to give up. He attempts to climb again and finally reaches the top of the manifold. Exhausted, Chris remembers Morgan. We see Morgan is also missing Chris dearly and worrying about him. Her concern is valid, given the treacherous conditions Chris is working in. Chris, having lost hope, lies on the manifold, his breathing slow. It's a proof to Chris's courage that he made it to the top. As Morgan thinks of Chris, his eyes close and the light around him fades. His oxygen supply is depleted and his life is engulfed in darkness. In the bell, Duncan and Dave are worried about their fellow diver. Craig in the control room is concerned for his diver's safety, while Hannah and the captain work to control the ship. Craig attempts to locate Chris using an ROV, remotely operated vehicle, and sees that Chris is lying on top of the manifold, his hands moving slightly, but his eyes closed, with no visible signs of breathing. Craig instructs Andrew, the ROV pilot, to use the ROV to bring Chris up, but according to Andrew, the ROV is only useful for retrieving dead bodies. With no other options, Craig takes responsibility for completing the task, determined to save Chris by any means possible. I really appreciate the responsible and determined nature of Craig as a supervisor. Craig takes control of the ROV and carefully maneuvers it towards Chris to catch him. Despite multiple attempts, Craig struggles to find a secure hold on Chris. Chris is unconscious but still breathing without oxygen. After repeated efforts, Craig finally manages to grab Chris's strap with the ROV and pulls him up. However, Chris gets stuck again, and Craig discovers that Chris's strap is entangled in the manifold's wreckage. Oxygen deprived for over 16 minutes, Chris is still alive. Duncan shares a story with Dave in the bell about 2 divers who lost their lives in a similar incident and how one of the bodies was never found. Duncan becomes emotional, not wanting Morgan to only recover Chris's shoe. In the control room, the DPO successfully restores the thruster's connection, re-establishing communication between the control room and the bell. Craig informs Duncan and Dave about Chris's location, prompting Dave to prepare for another dive to rescue Chris. Duncan is concerned for both Chris and Dave, not wanting to lose either of his divers. Dave exits the bell and receives clearance from the control room to dive safely. Craig continues to monitor Chris via the ROV, seeing that he's still unconscious but alive. Dave reaches Chris at the manifold and quickly releases the lock, freeing Chris. Dave then attaches Chris to his umbilical and begins to climb upwards. Despite the challenges posed by the ship's jerking movements and Chris's weight, Dave manages to bring Chris back to the bell. Duncan pulls Chris into the bell, removes his helmet, and tries to revive him. Chris has been without oxygen for over 28 minutes and is extremely pale. Duncan attempts to give Chris first aid, sharing his own breath, but Chris remains unresponsive. Just as all hope seems lost, Chris starts gasping, and Duncan quickly pulls him up and sits him in the bell. Dave enters the bell, and the control room receives word that Chris is breathing. Although Chris is alive, he's still unconscious due to prolonged oxygen deprivation. Duncan and Dave try to engage Chris in conversation, but he doesn't respond. They attempt to stimulate some movement from Chris, but to no avail. Eventually, Duncan and Dave lose hope, believing it's too late for Chris to recover. Duncan and Dave are emotional, thinking they've lost Chris, when suddenly Chris looks at Dave and starts talking. This sparks a wave of joy in the bell. Duncan and Dave rush to Chris's side. In the control room, Craig is overjoyed, relieved that his diver has survived the chaos and is now responding. The control room erupts in celebration, and the other teams in their chambers share in the joy. Chris is puzzled by his friend's reaction, wondering what caused them to be so emotional. In the control room, Craig praises the captain's performance, and the team shares in the appreciation. Craig then informs Team A that they'll be returning to the surface chamber. In my point of view, this was all possible due to good leadership. If Craig hadn't made the decision to rescue Chris, he might have died at sea. Afterwards, we see Chris resting in the chamber, where Dave takes care of him. Chris learns that he was unconscious for 40 minutes but was rescued. He feels guilty for worrying Morgan, as he had promised to ensure his safety before leaving. Then Dave leaves Chris for rest and looks at pictures of his daughters, becoming emotional. Chris spends his days recovering in the chamber, undergoing decompression. During this time, Chris updates Morgan on his well-being but doesn't tell her about the incident, making up an excuse about a problem with the ship. Chris doesn't want to worry Morgan, so he keeps the incident to himself. As the days pass, heads decided a leave for team members, so the chamber doors open. All teams exit their chambers. Duncan bids farewell to Chris and returns to his chamber, claiming he forgot his pillow. However, the truth is that he wants to spend a little more time in the chamber as it's his last ride. Craig appreciates Duncan's services. Meanwhile, Chris reunites with his fiancée, Morgan, and eventually shares his incident with her. Morgan becomes anxious, but Chris reassures her that no matter what happens, he'll always return to her. The two then head home together. Chris was without oxygen for 29 minutes, but miraculously suffered no lasting physical or mental damage. This may have been due to a unique combination of depth and temperature. However, experts still can't explain how he survived. In my opinion, it was a miracle. After this incident, Morgan and Chris get married, starting their happy life together. 3 weeks after the incident, Chris, Duncan, and Dave return to the North Sea to complete their mission, marking the end of the film. If you liked this heart-pumping true story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel for the latest updates on intense survival movies and more.